Welcome to the Power of One. Today, we are going to have a very intense conversation, and we're going to be speaking about pedophilia. Please understand and please know that our heart goes out to any children that was sexually abused. Today, I'm going to have Dr. Etzi on the show. Welcome to the show, Dr. Etzi.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Dr. Etzi, what is pedophilia?
I wish it were a simple answer. I'm afraid to say it's not a simple answer, but so according to the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that psychologists and psychiatrists, it's a psychiatric tool, but all mental health professionals use the DSM when they need to come up with a diagnosis for somebody. So pedophilia is listed in the DSM technically as a mental disorder, okay? So I'm going to give you the criteria or the definition according to DSM of what pedophilia is. So pedophilic disorder, okay, is within the larger category of paraphilias, meaning any kind of deviant is one word that's used. Sexual behaviors might come into under this category. So pedophilia is under paraphilias. Here's the definition. Over a period of at least 6 months, recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasies, urges, or behaviors involving sexual activity with a prepubescent child aged 13 years or younger. Okay, so that's the DSM. Basically, that's the definition. The word itself is interesting because pedophilia, the origin of the word, philia means love, as Philadelphians know. It's the city of brotherly love. Phila is the love part of that. And pedo is child. Okay. So pedophilia, ironically, means love of children. Right. We all know that, that's a really interesting, incorrect use of the word love. But just to tell you, so this all gets really complicated and really confusing the deeper we get into what the nature of pedophilia is about.
Are there different types of pedophilia and different types of pedophilic disorder?
There really isn't. I mean, pedophilia is pedophilia. What gets really difficult around this disorder is that folks who are sexually aroused by children, okay, and either acting out on that arousal or not, very rarely come in for treatment or therapy. Very rarely. So what's happening is, I really should mention that most pedophiles have been sexually abused as children themselves. Now, we don't have good statistics or data on this, and you might understand why from the outset. Again, these folks aren't coming into clinics. They're not getting diagnosed. They come to our attention after they've acted out and got caught. And so, it becomes a legal punishment issue. Rarely comes into treatment or therapy issue. So it's real hard to get statistics or a good understanding. My understanding comes from working with a lot of folks, children, adolescents, adults who have been sexually abused. That's where my knowledge is coming from. So I know there's a lot of there's way too much sexual abuse. We all know that.
Mhm.
But there's even more. I mean, there's more sexual abuse out there than we know about, right?
Mhm.
There's more. And that's why we don't have a good idea of how much is going on. Because, and I don't have the data in front of me, but it's a small, actually, it's a small portion what gets reported compared to what's actually happening. Most of it's not being reported.
That's
Go
because
ahead.
people don't actually get caught. So you take this adult that positions themselves where there are children, and nine
Right.
times out of ten, they're very close to the children, or could be related to the children. And a pedophile could be any race,
For sure.
adult age, and,
Yes.
and of any social class, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I remember I was working with an 8-year-old girl who had been sexually abused over a period of years, like at least 3 years. So she was at least 5 years old when it began. She came to me when she was 8, and she was being abused by her grandfather and a friend of his who was the same age as him. So two older men. It can be anybody.
Now,
Any,
do they know that what they're doing is wrong?
they sure do.
Mm.
They sure do. You know, the other thing about pedophilia is like a lot of other uh, paraphilias and addictions. I myself kind of can put it in that category psychologically, although it's not psychiatrically, but psychologically, I link it to that category. It's a compulsive behavior. The experience of the urge is I can't help it. Now, that doesn't mean they can't help it.
Right.
It's just that a compulsion is extremely powerful. And once something like uh, a sexual compulsion is satisfied by going through with it, and then because that sexual satisfaction then reinforces, it's kind of a reward system to the brain, which is how basically addictions work. When you go and take that substance that you're addicted to, kind of compulsively, you feel you must have it right now. Then once you take that substance or satisfy that sexual compulsion, it reinforces you to do it again. It reinforces your very physiology to do it again, which is why it's very, very difficult to treat. And added to the fact that these folks aren't coming to treatment because
Mm.
they're afraid to. One
Mm.
reason is they're afraid to. They're afraid that therapists, psychiatrists, and they're kind of right, are not going to know what to do with this,
Mhm.
and might report them. And so it's a huge problem because they don't feel like they can come and talk to a therapist and say, I want to have sex with children, you know.
Mhm.
Now, maybe after a long period of time where they know they trust someone, because a therapist is not allowed to divulge any information, of course, unless that person is hurting a child, is
Right.
actually going through with it, then they must report it. But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
see how entangled this whole thing gets.
Dr. Etzi, they're children. And
Yes.
it's just heartbreaking to know that someone is harming a child. So this addiction that is causing pleasure to this pedophile is actually hurting a child. Is that part of the addiction, the hurt and control over someone?
I would, that's a really interesting question. And again, it's not simple. And I want to preface it by saying every pedophile is different.
Mm,
Just like every depressed person is
mhm,
different.
mhm,
Every anxious person is different. So we can't say there's no one size fits all, but we can say a few things. Uh, Pleasure and hurting. Yeah, for sure. Those children are hurt and they know it. Now let's remember the pedophile, him or herself, was most likely, if not always, sexually abused.
mm,
Okay. So in that person's mind, when they're an adult, their whole psychology, including their sexuality, okay, um, is kind of made up of. So relationship. So if the person was abused as a child, most likely it's someone they knew, someone they trusted. Most of the time, someone they knew, someone they trusted. If it happens again and again, now it's a relationship. They still trust, I'll put in quotation marks, that person because they kind of have no choice. Like my 8-year old that I told you about, she was living with the grandfather. Um, and so she really trusted him and she kind of loved him. And
mhm.
so then, and she was 5 when it began. You know, a 5-year old, a 6-year old, a 7-year old, an 8-year old, a 9-year old is not able to think this through.
Right.
They're not able to think this through or make any sense of it. That's what makes it traumatic. Okay. Because they know they're being exploited, but they don't understand what in the world's going on. They know they're in danger. I mean, when I have worked with some of these children, you know, it is heartbreaking because you can see I mean, some people call it soul murder, that how damaged, how devastated inside they are. And it might not show on the outside. And so many people carry this through into their adulthood until, you know, at some point, often, we don't know how often, then they start to act it out. But as long as there's no help for people, you know, and I always say this is my major complaint about getting psychological, emotional help. It's hard for people to get in-depth psychological and emotional help. Very hard. Insurance companies don't cover
Right.
in-depth kinds of therapy, you know. That child is being hurt, but the nature of that hurt is so very confusing and easy to kind of bury because there's a terrible sense of shame connected with it, which is why we don't hear about how often it's going on. They know they've been hurt, but they're also terribly ashamed. And most children, without even realizing it, blame themselves.
Mhm, mm,
And so it's easy for an adult, a pedophile, to convince a child not to tell
mhm,
because they'll
mhm,
treat that child well. You know, they'll be very caring and kind and gentle, maybe give them gifts and maybe even show them love. Maybe no one else is. You know, sexual abuse is usually connected with neglect and other kinds of abuse. It rarely exists all by itself. If it does exist all by itself, those children are much more resilient and can overcome than the other children, where it's all tangled up in these relationships.
In doing some research, I saw a statement, and hopefully you can speak to this. It said pedophilia is self-discovered, not chosen.
Yeah.
Break that down for me.
I saw that you sent that to me, and here's what I think that's referring to. I mean, that's really true of anyone's sexuality. I mean, that's the other conversation that doesn't get enough attention. Somehow in 2024, in this culture, it's still uncomfortable for most people to talk about sexuality and sex, as adults, and talk about healthy sexuality. It just doesn't happen enough. But like anyone's sexuality, the experience is, I didn't choose it. This is what I am. And I don't know if you remember being a teenager. I sure do, because I remember how confusing it was to understand my sexuality. And it seems like every generation it gets more and more confusing. As Americans, and when I was a teenager, the women's liberation movement was opening up, and free love and sexual liberation. It's really confusing to a 13, 14, 15-year-old, because you might feel desire depending on your own physiology and sexual makeup, but yet we still have these rules about masculinity, femininity, who's a good girl, who's not a good girl, all that stuff, your religious upbringing, all that stuff. It gets really confusing. So you can't just choose what your sexual desire is about. You have to learn about it. You have to discover it. You have to understand it. And I'm afraid that with very little guidance from parents, other elders, we can't learn this in a sex education class in school.
Right.
There's no way, right? And so sadly, too many young people and older people are going online. I mean, and you know certainly how huge an industry pornography is.
Right.
And that's the other thing that we really needs to be addressed when we're talking about pedophilia. Pornography is huge. It's a huge part of it because it keeps it active. It keeps it normalized, right? It's like, what's wrong with pornography? It's a slippery slope.
Right. Is there a difference between pedophiles and sex offenders?
Well, sex offenders, that's a legal term. I mean, once you've committed a sexual offense, that's kind of a criminal behavior. So yeah, pedophilia is the psychiatric, psychological term. A sex offender may or may not be a pedophile.
Okay. So a sex offender could be two adults.
Correct.
And I said no at some point, and this person kept going, so they could be a sex offender, classified as a sex offender.
Correct.
Okay. Is there treatment for a pedophile?
There's no one treatment. There's no good research on this. There's some, but these folks aren't getting into therapy. I mean, once they're caught, let's say they're in prison, they're not getting much therapy in prison, I can tell you. So, I mean, I would say that good therapy is good therapy. And that means really developing a very trusting relationship between the pedophile and the person so that eventually, and it takes time, that person's going to be willing to open up about their own trauma. Like I said, most likely that person was sexually abused, was sexually exploited as a child. And if that isn't being discussed, if the person isn't healing from
Mhm.
that trauma, no therapy is going to do anything.
And that's probably because, and I'm going to speak for me, if I hear of someone raping a child or sexually abusing a child, at that point, I'm disgusted.
Of
And I
course.
guess that's how it is in our system as a whole. We're disgusted and we just want to lock them up and throw away
Right.
the key. But it doesn't seem as though we've thought through how can we treat this person so when they're done their prison sentence and they come out, they do not do this to another child.
Yeah. And, my guess is they're going to be worse.
Mm,
Because, I
yeah,
mean, think about prison. Think about
yeah,
that.
right. And then
So
that's not curing it. So and I did hear you say that some pedophiles were sexually abused as children.
most,
Can most of the time
most.
can a mental illness cause someone to be a pedophile?
Well, okay, here again. Um, so so unfortunately, okay, I'm a psychologist, and unfortunately, psychiatry, the medical arm of the mental health professions, psychiatrists are MDs who study a little bit of psychology for about 6 months. Okay. They're mostly prescribing meds. Okay.
Okay.
Psychologists only study psychology.
Mm-hmm.
But psychiatry has defined what mental illness is. And the problem I have with psychiatry's definition of mental illness is it slices them all up as if they're different and specific. I know as a psychologist that psychology is psychology and it involves emotions and thoughts and the whole person. It can't be divided up. Technically, if someone is diagnosed with pedophilia, that definition I read from the DSM,
Mm-hmm.
that's considered a mental illness. Now,
Okay.
to me, that's not very helpful because there's no specific treatment for that mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
So what
Mm-hmm.
I'm more interested in is if I'm doing therapy with a pedophile, I'm going to assume that that person was sexually abused as a child. So I know they've been traumatized. So actually trauma is also in DSM. So that's technically a mental disorder. I'm less concerned with the mental illness side of it. I'm more concerned with the suffering that this person has experienced most of their lives, all their lives maybe, and is still suffering from and have never done any healing or understanding work. And for me, that's where it needs to happen. So technically, to answer your question, they all have a mental illness, whether it's diagnosed or not. If you are so compelled to act out these urges with the child, there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Call it mental illness or not, there's something very wrong. And deep down, these folks know it. They're in pain. They're in deep, deep pain. And the sexual acting out is like a drug. It gets rid of the pain for a short period of time, but it always comes back. Always comes back. The pain is there. The emotional suffering will still be there.
Thank you so much for joining me today,
You're
Doctor.
welcome. It was my pleasure as always.
Very hard conversation. If you know someone who has been sexually abused, physically abused, or neglected as a child, there is a number you can call, 1-800-422-4453. And that is the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453. Peace and love.